On the day Mom and Dad divorced, two divorce agreements lay on the table. The first one stated that the child was to stay in the old house, in the old town with Dad, Chuck Browning, who was addicted to gambling and riddled with debt. The second one stated that the child was to go to the coastal town, with Mom, Marina Dillon, who had remarried a wealthy businessman. In my previous life, my younger sister, Tamara Browning, cried and begged to stay with Mom. So, I silently packed my bags and went with Dad instead. Later on, Dad quit his gambling habits and received a large settlement for selling off his old house in a land appropriation project. And that was when he began pampering and showering me with affection. Meanwhile, Tamara suffered emotional abuse at her stepfather's home, as she was forbidden from leaving the house at all. Eventually, she died of depression. Now that we were reborn, Tamara snatched the cigarette away from Dad's fingers and hugged him tightly. I feel sorry for Dad. Tiana, you can go ahead and enjoy your life with Mom. I'll let you take it. Dad was stunned momentarily. Then he stroked Tamara's head with a look of relief. I said nothing and picked up the train ticket. That would bring me to the coastal town. Tamara had no idea that Dad only managed to quit his gambling habits because I had worked myself to the bone, paying off his debts while suffering from a brain tumor. Dad finally saw the error of his ways after I nearly gave up my life for him. And now that I was reborn, I no longer had to put up with the voices of the debt collectors hounding us anymore. All I wanted was just a good night's sleep. I picked up my worn-out suitcase. Get out of here. Go look for your gold digger of a mother. Instead, Dad said, waving his hand dismissively at me like I was just an annoying fly. Tamara hid behind him and made a face at me. She mouthed, "Don't come begging me for money the next time you see me." I smiled and said nothing. Instead, I turned around and walked out into the rain, flinching at the cold. I could feel the chills seeping into my bones. Wouldn't make much of a difference wherever I went anyway. I just wanted someplace quiet to spend the last of my days, getting through everything. At least, I no longer needed to hear the debt collectors hounding at the door, or put up with the horrible stench of cigarettes anymore. Mom's black Mercedes was parked at the entrance to an alleyway. The car windows rolled down, revealing Mom's youthful, well-maintained face. She frowned as she stared at my drenched body, a look of disgust in her eyes. "How did you end up like this? Hurry up and get it, and make sure not to dirty the interior of the car." I opened the back seat door and was just about to enter when she said, "Throw that suitcase into the back." She pointed at my suitcase and said, "That's so filthy, I don't even know what germs it's covered in." I hesitated for a moment. However, I still did as she said and put the suitcase in the trunk of the car. When I finally got back inside the car, I did my best to stay in a corner and take up as little space as possible, not daring to touch the leather seats. The air conditioning in the car had been turned on, but I still felt very cold. "Make sure you behave yourself when we reach that place, Tiana," Mom said, looking at me in the rearview mirror while driving. "Your new stepfather doesn't like noise. Stay in your room as much as possible and don't come out. Don't chew with your mouth open. And don't drag your feet on the floor while walking. Also, don't you ever bring up your dad. He's nothing but bad luck." I looked at the fleeting raindrops outside the window and nodded. "Got it." I felt a sudden sharp pain in my brain. My vision went black for a while, and I hurriedly held my head in my hand. "What's wrong?" Mom asked, sounding impatient. "Nothing, just a little car sick." "You're so delicate," she said with a scoff, "just like your dad." I closed my eyes and forcefully swallowed, the metallic taste rising in my throat. I didn't want to come back here anymore if I could be reborn again. The car drove on for 5 hours. It was dark by the time we arrived at the huge mansion, located halfway up the mountain. The place was flooded with lights. However, it was as quiet as death itself. "We're here," Mom said, parking the car and touching up her lipstick. Then she inhaled deeply as she reconditioned herself. Soon, she turned from the harsh and irritable woman earlier into a kind and understanding wife and mother. "Let's go. Remember to greet your stepfather properly later." I dragged my suitcase with me and walked after Mom. There was a man seated in the center of the couch in the living room. A blanket was draped over his lap, and he was holding a book in his hands. He looked up when he heard us at the door. This was my new stepfather, Leonard Newton. Leonard was also the same person who had driven Tamara to her death in her past life. "You're back." His voice was flat and void of all emotion. "Leonard, this is Tiana," Mom said, nudging me forward with a smile on her face. "Tiana, you can refer to him as just Leo." I walked forward and nodded politely at him. "Nice to meet you, Leo." He flipped a page in his book, looking like he never heard me. A few seconds later, he finally hummed slightly through his nose. His gaze swept over my wet shoes, and I could see him frown slightly. The carpet was just replaced. He looked back down at his book again and continued. The first door on the second floor is the guest bedroom. It's already been cleaned up. Thank you, Leo. Mom sighed in relief. Then she began pulling me up the stairs. See, Leonard is a very nice person, Mom said, lowering her voice. Just don't make him mad, and your life here will be pleasant. I went into the guest bedroom. It was very large and empty. Mom, I said, stopping her from leaving. What is it? Can I get a change of rooms? Mom's expression fell immediately. Tiana Browning, you've only been here for less than 5 minutes. And you're already making demands. What's wrong with this room? Isn't it 100 times better than the doghouse your dad calls a home? Stop being such an ingrate. I watched calmly as Mom lost her temper with me. When she was finally done shouting, I said, it's not that this room is facing the north. And it's a little too chilly. I just want to stay in a room facing the south. I'm fine if the room is a lot smaller. I was really freezing at this point. A brain tumor had caused my internal temperature regulation to go haywire, and I constantly felt like I was living in a freezer. Only the sunlight could make me feel slightly better. Too chilly. Then turn on the heater. Mom thought that I was kicking up a fuss for nothing. The room facing the south is Leonard's study. The only other one is a storeroom. Then I'll take the storeroom, I said. Mom's eyes doubled in disbelief. Are you crazy? What? Why are you insisting on staying in the storeroom when there's a comfortable guest bedroom prepared for you? Are you trying to make Leonard think that I'm abusing and mistreating you on purpose? Mom's voice was shrill and loud. I covered my ears because it was too noisy. I could feel the veins in my brain throbbing painfully. I'm just afraid of the cold, I said, repeating myself, just. Then there were a few soft knocks on the door. I didn't know how long Leonard had been standing there for. He was holding a glass of water in his hands, and there was a dark look on his face. What's the noise about? Mom's expression changed at once. Her voice shook as she said, it's nothing, Leonard. This child is just being difficult and complaining about the room. I'm just teaching her a lesson. Leonard looked at me and I also looked at him. He looked pallid. There wasn't any color on his lips, and he looked like he was close to death. Where do you want to stay? Then he asked. In a room facing the south, I said, pointing at the end of the corridor. That's where we keep all the old furniture. He replied, that's fine. It doesn't matter as long as it lets the sun in. Leonard went silent for a while. Then he said, suit yourself. Just don't yell or make any noise in the hallway. With that, he turned and left, not the least bit interested in the argument between Mom and me. Mom then jabbed painfully at my head in a frustrated manner. Fine, do what you want. What do you think people are going to think of me when they learn that you're living in the storeroom? I ignored her and grabbed my suitcase, bringing it with me to the other end of the hallway. When I pushed the door open, I could smell the musty, dusty smell in the room at once. However, I immediately caught sight of the floor-to-ceiling windows in the room. I knew that this room was going to be very warm when the sun came up tomorrow, and that was more than enough. I made a makeshift bed on the ground and slid the photo album underneath my pillow. My diagnosis was tucked inside the album. Nobody would go through my things anyway unless I was a dead person. I fell into a very deep sleep that night. There was no shouting or hollering from the debt collectors. In my dreams, there was nothing but an endless abyss of darkness instead. Hence began my life in this household as an invisible person. Leonard preferred the quiet. Even the maids in the house walked on tiptoe. Meanwhile, Mom kept trying every possible way to please him and curry his favor. He made him stews, massaged him often, and also kept him company when he was watching those dry and boring financial news reports on TV. In other words, Mom was acting more like a nanny than a wife in this household. As for me, I barely left my room unless it was for meals. I made sure to keep the storeroom spick and span. It might be piled high with old furniture, but the sunlight in here was divine. I would often position my chair before the windows and stay there for the entire afternoon, just like an old lady basking in the sun before her imminent death. At times, Leonard would walk past my door and pause when he saw me in front of the windows. However, he never spoke a word to me. His gaze was a little strange. It looked as though he were looking at one of his own kind. During lunchtime that day, it was very quiet at the table, as always, with only the sound of silverware clinking against the plates and bowls. Suddenly, my phone began vibrating loudly, sounding like an alarm. In the silence, Leonard frowned. Mom immediately set down her utensils and glared at me. Who told you to bring your phone to the table? Where are your manners? Hang up now. I brought out my phone and glanced momentarily at the screen. It was tomorrow. I canceled the call. However, less than 2 seconds later, it vibrated loudly again, hung up again, and she called again for the third time in a row. When the phone vibrated for the third time, Leonard set down his fork and said, answer it. His voice was soft and quiet. It's annoying and gives me a headache. I brought my phone out to the balcony. Right after answering the call, Tamara's voice exploded on the other end of the line. Tiana Browning, you did this on purpose, didn't you? Where did you put the checks? I held the phone slightly away from my ear, listening to the shrill, frantic screech of my sister. In the background, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of things being shattered, followed by a man's low, drunken cursing. What checks, Tamara? I asked, my voice flat, almost whispery. My head throbbed, a dull, pulsing ache right behind my eyes. Don't play dumb with me. The checks Dad used to pay off the loan sharks. And the settlement money for the house. I searched his entire room, and all I found were stacks of red warning letters and IOUs. Where did you hide the money from your part-time jobs? I almost wanted to laugh, but the effort was too much for my aching skull. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the balcony door, staring out at the misty, dark gardens of the Newton estate. There's no money, Tamara, I said quietly, letting the cold wind from the cracked door bite my face. And there are no checks. The government appropriation for the old house doesn't happen for another 3 years. And even when it does, it won't be enough to cover a fraction of what Dad owes if he keeps gambling. You're lying. In our last life, Dad quit gambling right after Mom left. He showered you with designer bags, bought you a car, and we lived like royalty. Why is he still gambling now? Why are there men banging on the door with iron pipes right now? Her voice trembled, a mixture of mounting rage and sheer, raw terror. I could picture her perfectly, huddled in the corner of that damp, mold-infested living room in the old town, clutching the phone like a lifeline, realizing too late that the blessed life she had snatched from me was actually a yawning abyss. He quit in the last life because I worked myself to death, I said, my voice steady, devoid of any anger. I worked 3 jobs, Tamara. I begged the loan sharks. I knelt in the rain on the concrete. I let them slap me, and I handed over every single cent I earned. It took me 4 years of sleeping 3 hours a night, vomiting blood from the stress, to pay off his principal debt of $200,000. All while the tumor in my brain grew from the size of a pebble to a walnut. There was a sudden, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. Tumor? She whispered, her voice cracking. Dad didn't change because he suddenly found his conscience. I continued, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. He changed because one day, I collapsed on the kitchen floor, bleeding from my nose and ears, with a stack of paid-off debt receipts clutched in my hand. He realized his addiction had literally killed his eldest daughter. But this time, I'm not there to die for him. Good luck, Tamara. I hung up before she could say another word. I blocked her number, deleted the call history, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. When I walked back into the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mom was sitting rigidly, her fork hovering over her plate, her eyes darting nervously toward Leonard. Who was that? Mom demanded, her voice sharp with forced irritation. I told you your stepfather likes his peace. It is incredibly rude to have your phone vibrating like that during lunch. A wrong number, I said, sliding back into my seat. I picked up my spoon, but my hands were shaking so badly from the cold that the broth spilled back into the bowl. Leonard didn't look up from his plate. He cut his steak with slow, precise movements, his pale, thin fingers holding the knife with steady control. Yet I noticed how shallow his breathing was. Every few minutes, his chest would shudder slightly, as if it took a conscious effort to draw air into his lungs. If it happens again, leave the phone in your room, Leonard said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an icy finality that made Mom flinch. Of course, Leonard, she won't do it again, Mom said quickly, a tight, placating smile stretching across her face. She reached over and sharply tapped my wrist. Did you hear that, Tiana? Keep your trashy phone in your room. I didn't answer. I just swallowed another spoonful of soup, welcoming the temporary warmth it brought to my throat. Over the next few weeks, I became a ghost in the Newton mansion. I spent almost all my time in the south-facing storeroom. I had cleared out a small corner for myself, pushing a heavy, dust-covered mahogany wardrobe aside to make room for a small single mattress. The room was cluttered with old oil paintings, broken grandfather clocks, and stacks of outdated financial journals, but when the morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the entire space was bathed in a bright, golden warmth. I would drag a wooden stool to the center of the sunbeam, wrap myself in a thin quilt, and sit there for hours. My vision was starting to blur the edges, and sometimes I would lose my balance just trying to stand up, but the quiet was intoxicating. There were no yelling voices, no smell of stale beer and cheap cigarettes, no heavy boots kicking at the front door demanding money. Just the quiet rustle of the wind outside and the gentle warmth of the sun on my face. One afternoon, as I was sitting by the window, the door to the storeroom creaked open. I turned my head slowly. Leonard was standing in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit today. Instead, he wore a simple charcoal gray cardigan, and he leaned heavily on a black cane. Without the sharp tailoring of his formal clothes, he looked incredibly frail, almost translucent. He stood there for a long moment, his dark, hollow eyes scanning the dusty room before finally landing on me. "Why do you sit here?" he asked. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of the cold authority he used downstairs. "It's warm," I replied, pulling the quilt tighter around my shoulders. "The sun is very nice here." Leonard looked at the sunbeam hitting the floorboards. Then, he looked at my pale, sunken cheeks and the slight tremor in my hands. A faint, knowing expression flickered across his face, the look of someone who recognized a fellow traveler on a very dark road. "You're shivering," he noted. "I'm always a little cold." He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked away, his cane clicking softly against the hardwood floor of the corridor. An hour later, one of the household maids, a quiet woman who usually avoided me, knocked on my door. She was carrying a thick, heavy duvet made of genuine down, along with a small, electric space heater. "Mr. Newton asked me to bring these to you," she said, keeping her head down. "He said the heating in this wing of the house is old, and you shouldn't freeze." "Thank you," I whispered. That night, for the first time in months, my feet didn't feel like blocks of ice. I curled up under the heavy duvet, the gentle hum of the space heater filling the dark room, and slept without a single nightmare. While my world grew quieter, Tamara's world was tearing at the seams. Because I had blocked her number, she began calling Mom. At first, Mom ignored the calls, dismissing them as her ex-husband's family trying to beg for money. But as the days went on, the calls became more frequent, and Mom's expressions during breakfast grew increasingly strained. One morning, as Mom was pouring Leonard's coffee, her hand shook, spilling a few drops onto the immaculate white tablecloth. Leonard frowned, his eyes locking onto the stain. "Marina." "I'm so sorry, Leonard." "I'll clean it up right away," Mom gasped, her face turning pale as she frantically dabbed at the cloth with a napkin. I haven't been sleeping well. The telemarketers have been very persistent lately." "Is that so?" Leonard said, his tone dry. He took a sip of his coffee. "I suggest you change your number. I don't tolerate messiness, physical or mental, in this house." "Yes, of course. I'll do it today," Mom promised, her voice trembling. I sat quietly, chewing my toast slowly. I knew exactly who those telemarketers were. In our previous life, when Tamara stayed with Mom and I stayed with Dad, Tamara had quickly realized that Leonard was a strict, tyrannical man who demanded absolute obedience and quiet. But Tamara, who was spoiled and loud, couldn't handle the rules. She threw tantrums, demanded expensive clothes, and tried to steal money from Mom's purse to buy her way into wealthy social circles. To keep the peace, Leonard had forbidden her from leaving the estate, cutting off her allowance and locking her in her room whenever she misbehaved. Mom, terrified of losing her wealthy husband, had stood by and let it happen, even joining in on the emotional abuse to prove her loyalty to Leonard. Tamara had eventually succumbed to severe depression and took her own life. But in this life, the horror Tamara was facing was entirely different. Without me to shield Dad from his debts, the loan sharks had wasted no time. They had taken the old house as collateral weeks ago, throwing Dad and Tamara onto the streets. Dad, desperate and facing withdrawal from his gambling addiction, had likely turned his anger on Tamara, blaming her for stealing the chance to go with Mom. 3 days later, the storm finally reached the mountain. It was a Tuesday evening, and the rain was pouring down in torrential sheets, hammering against the windows of the grand living room. Leonard was sitting in his armchair by the fireplace, a book in his hand, while Mom sat on the sofa nearby, knitting a sweater in a desperate bid to look like a domestic, peaceful wife. I was sitting on a low stool near the hearth, letting the warmth of the fire seep into my aching bones. My tumor was progressing rapidly now. I could barely see out of my left eye, and a constant, high-pitched ringing echoed in my ears. Suddenly, the quiet of the house was shattered by the sound of muffled shouting outside, followed by the heavy clanging of the iron security gates at the end of the driveway. Mom froze, her knitting needles clacking together. "What is that?" Leonard didn't look up from his book, but his brow furrowed. A moment later, the butler entered the living room, his face pale and distressed. "Mr. Newton, I apologize for the intrusion. There is a young girl at the gate. She bypassed the security intercom and is screaming for Mrs. Newton. She's drenched, and she claims she won't leave until she speaks to her mother." Mom's face drained of all color. She stood up so fast her knitting basket tumbled to the floor, balls of yarn rolling across the expensive carpet. "Send her away," Mom cried, her voice cracking with panic. "She's a lunatic. A beggar. Call the police, call security, just don't let her in." "Marina," Leonard said, his voice dropping a register. The sheer coldness in his tone made Mom freeze in her tracks. He slowly closed his book and set it on the side table. "Who is at my gate?" It's nobody, Leonard. Just a troubled girl from my past. Mom stammered, her hands clutching her chest. I swear, I have nothing to do with her anymore. She's your daughter, isn't she? Leonard said. He looked at me, then back at Mom. The one who stayed with the gambler. Before Mom could reply, the heavy front doors of the mansion were pushed open. Tamara had somehow slipped past the gate guards while they were distracted. She burst into the foyer, dripping wet, her hair plastered to her face, her cheap clothes covered in mud. She looked half wild, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her lips blue from the cold.
Mom.
Tamara screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer. Mom, you have to help me. You have to save me. Mom shrunk back, hiding behind Leonard's armchair as if Tamara were a rabid animal. Get out. How dare you break into this house?
Guards.
Where are the guards? Tamara didn't look at Mom. Her eyes swept over the luxurious foyer, the warm fireplace, and finally landed on me. I was sitting quietly by the hearth, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket, looking pale but entirely at peace. A look of pure, unadulterated hatred twisted Tamara's wet face. You, Tamara hissed, taking a heavy step forward, leaving a trail of muddy water on the pristine white marble. You knew this would happen. That's why you didn't fight me for Mom. You wanted me to go with Dad, so I would be ruined. I looked at her, my expression calm. I didn't choose anything, Tamara. You grabbed Dad's arm. You told me to go enjoy my life with Mom. I did exactly what you wanted. You lied to me, she shrieked, her voice cracking. You didn't tell me about the debt collectors. They came to the house, Tiana. They broke Dad's fingers in front of me. They took everything. And yesterday, Dad tried to sell me to one of the loan sharks to pay off his interest. He locked me in the basement, but I managed to crawl out of the coal chute. Look at me. She held out her hands, which were scraped raw and covered in black coal dust and dried blood. Mom, please. Tamara turned back to Mom, falling to her knees on the floor, weeping hysterically. Give me money. Just $500,000. That's all Dad owes. If we don't pay them by tomorrow, they said they'll take my legs. You're married to a billionaire, Mom. $500,000 is nothing to him. Please save me. Mom looked horrified, but her horror wasn't out of pity for Tamara. It was out of absolute terror of Leonard's reaction. She looked down at the mud staining her beautiful floors, then at Leonard's rigid, silent figure. Are you insane? Mom screamed at Tamara, her voice shrill and cruel. $500,000? Where would I get that kind of money? I don't have a single cent of my own. Everything belongs to Leonard. Go back to your father. He's the one who ran up those debts, not me. I divorced him to get away from this trash. But I'm your daughter. Tamara wailed, her chest heaving as she sobbed. You can't just leave me to die. Tiana is living here like a princess, and I'm being hunted like an animal. It's not fair. It's not fair. Tiana doesn't ask for $500,000, a cold, calm voice interrupted. Everyone turned to look at Leonard. He was still sitting in his chair, his hands folded over his cane. His gaze was fixed on Tamara, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. She doesn't demand luxury, Leonard continued, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. She doesn't throw tantrums. She has lived in a dusty storeroom for weeks, eating whatever is put in front of her, staying out of the way, and keeping this house quiet. And you bring your filth, your noise, and your father's trash into my home. Stepfather, please. Tamara pleaded, crawling toward him on her knees. I can be quiet too. I can do whatever you want. Just give me the money. I'll be your perfect daughter. I don't need a daughter, Leonard said flatly. He looked up at the butler. Call the police. Have this girl arrested for trespassing and breaking and entering. And call the estate security. Tell them that if anyone from the Browning family ever gets within a mile of this mountain again, they are fired.
No.
Mom, do something. Please. Tamara screamed as the security guards finally rushed into the foyer, grabbing her by her muddy arms and dragging her backward. Mom stood frozen, her face pale, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a single word. She didn't even look at Tamara. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her survival instinct completely overriding any trace of maternal instinct. Tiana, you monster. You did this to me. Tamara shrieked as she was dragged out into the pouring rain, her screams fading into the sound of the thunder. I hate you. I hate you. The heavy oak doors slammed shut. The foyer returned to a suffocating silence, save for the crackling of the fire. Leonard slowly turned his head to look at Mom. Clean up this mess, Marina. And if I hear another loud noise from your family, you'll be joining them on the streets by tomorrow morning. Yes, Leonard. Of course, Leonard. I'll clean it right now, Mom whispered, her voice shaking as she fell to her knees, using her own silk scarf to wipe the muddy footprints off the marble. I watched her, a hollow feeling in my chest. In my previous life, Tamara had died of depression in this very house, driven mad by the cold, silent control of Leonard, and Mom's complicit cruelty. In this life, she would suffer a different, perhaps more violent fate at the hands of the loan sharks and our father. But as I felt another sharp, agonizing throb in my temple, I realized it didn't matter. The wheel of fate had turned, but for me, the destination remained exactly the same. By the next morning, my condition had taken a sharp turn for the worse. When I tried to sit up, a wave of intense dizziness washed over me, and I threw up a small amount of dark, metallic-tasting fluid into a bucket beside my bed. My left eye was completely dark now, and the ringing in my ears had settled into a dull, constant roar. I lay back down on my pillow, too weak to even pull the duvet over my shoulders. At around noon, the door to the storeroom opened. It wasn't the maid, nor was it Leonard. It was Mom. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and a tense, defensive air about her. She was carrying a basket of clean laundry, but when she saw me still lying in bed, her face contorted with anger. "Tiana, what are you still doing in bed?" Mom snapped, walking over and dumping the basket onto the floor. "Do you have any idea what I went through last night? I was up until 3 in the morning scrubbing the foyer floor. And you just lie here like a lady of leisure. Get up and help me clean the guest rooms before Leonard gets angry again." I didn't move. I didn't have the strength to. "I can't, Mom. I'm tired." "Tired? You've done nothing but sit in this room for weeks." Mom raised her voice. Her frustration boiled over. She grabbed the edge of my blanket and violently yanked it off my body. "Get up. Don't you dare start acting like your sister. I won't let you ruin my life here." As she pulled the blanket, she caught the edge of my pillow. The old photo album I had kept tucked underneath slid out, hitting the floorboards with a dull thud. The album fell open, and a folded piece of paper slipped out from between the pages, landing right at Mom's feet. Mom paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at the paper. It was stamped with the official seal of the city's central hospital. "What is this?" she muttered, bending down to pick it up. "Don't," I whispered, but my voice was too weak to carry any authority. Mom unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the lines of text. I watched as her angry expression slowly froze, her mouth parting slightly as she read the words written in bold black ink. "Patient, Tiana Browning. Diagnosis, glioblastoma multiforme, stage for brain tumor. Prognosis, inoperable. Estimated life expectancy, 2 to 3 months. Date of diagnosis, September 14th. The room became incredibly quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the paper in Mom's trembling fingers. "Tiana?" Mom's voice was suddenly very small, stripped of all its harshness. She looked from the paper to me, her eyes wide with shock. What is this? Is this some kind of sick joke?" "It's not a joke," I said softly, staring up at the ceiling. "I was diagnosed before you and Dad signed the papers. That's why I didn't care which agreement I took." No, this can't be right," Mom stammered, her face turning pale. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say anything? We could have gone to the hospital. We could have gotten treatment." "With what money, Mom?" I asked, turning my head to look at her. "Dad's gambling money? Or Leonard's money? You told me on the first day that I was never to make a sound or ask for anything. You said Leonard didn't like noise. But this is different. You're my daughter," Mom cried, tears suddenly welling up in her eyes. She reached out to touch my forehead, but I flinched away from her hand. "You didn't care about your daughters, Mom," I said, my voice empty of resentment, stating it as a simple fact. "You only cared about staying in this mansion. If you had known I was sick, you would have left me with Dad anyway because a dying child is a burden. It makes too much noise." "That's not true. I love you, Tiana," Mom sobbed, covering her face with her hands. But I knew her tears weren't for me. They were the tears of a woman who realized she had failed in every possible way, as a mother, as a protector, and as a human being. She had traded her children for a life of luxury, only to find herself living with a dying daughter she had neglected and another daughter she had thrown to the wolves. "What is the shouting about?" Leonard was standing at the door. He was holding a glass of water, his dark eyes taking in the scene, Mom sobbing on her knees, the medical report in her hand, and me lying pale and motionless on the bed. Without a word, Leonard walked forward. He took the paper from Mom's hand and read it. His expression didn't change, but his eyes softened slightly as he looked down at me. "So," Leonard said quietly, "that's why you wanted the son?" "Yes," I whispered. Leonard turned his gaze to Mom, his eyes cold and filled with a profound disgust. "Get out, Marina." "Leonard, please, she's my daughter. We have to save her." "I said, get out," Leonard repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have ignored this girl since the day you brought her here. You let her sleep in a dusty room, you yelled at her for coughing, and you cared more about a stain on my tablecloth than the blood she was vomiting. You are a disgusting creature." Leave this room immediately before I have security throw you out alongside your other daughter." Mom shrunk back, her body trembling with fear. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading, but I closed my eyes, refusing to give her the absolution she wanted. She slowly stood up and crept out of the room, her soft sobs fading down the hallway. Chapter 6: The Quietest Son. Once Mom was gone, Leonard sat down on the wooden stool beside my bed. He set his cane aside and looked at me, his pale face reflecting the soft afternoon light. "I have some morphine," he said quietly. "The doctors gave it to me for the pain in my lungs, but I don't use it. It makes my head cloudy, and I prefer to keep my mind clear. But for you, it might help." "Thank you, Leo," I said. "The pain is getting very loud." He nodded. He stood up, walked out, and returned a few minutes later with a small vial and a syringe. With surprising gentleness, he helped me sit up, administered the medicine, and then laid me back down. Within minutes, the throbbing in my head began to fade, replaced by a warm, heavy numbness. The ringing in my ears quieted down to a gentle hum, like the sound of distant waves. "Do you want me to call a doctor?" Leonard asked, sitting back down. "Or a hospital?" "No," I replied, my voice slurring slightly. "Hospitals are too loud. Too many machines. I just want to be quiet." "I understand," Leonard said. He leaned back, staring out the window at the mountains. "People think that having money means you can buy peace. But the more money you have, the more people scream at you. They want your wealth, they want your favor, they want your blood. My first wife, my partners, your mother, they are all so loud." He looked back at me. "But you are the only quiet thing in this house." "I just wanted to sleep," I whispered. "Then sleep," Leonard said softly. "I'll make sure no one wakes you." I closed my eyes. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I felt completely safe. I didn't have to worry about the debt collectors banging on the door. I didn't have to worry about Dad's angry shouting, or Tamara's jealous screams, or Mom's frantic, desperate demands. The warmth of the sunbeam drifted across my face, golden and gentle. As I drifted off into the dark, quiet abyss, I felt a deep, profound sense of relief. I had given my life away once, but this time, I had kept the peaceful ending for myself.